The engine in front of me started on the first pull. I know the year it was built because the serial plate says so, 1951. That is not a restoration. It has never been rebuilt. The original pistons are still in the block, and when I check the compression with a gauge, every cylinder reads within 6% of the factory specification printed in the service manual on the workbench behind me. I am standing in a machine shed in central Kansas in summer heat. This engine has been running through every planting and every harvest since Harry Truman was in the White House. 6 months ago, I would have called someone dishonest for telling me that was possible. I spent 25 years replacing engines, paying shop rates that I now understand I never needed to pay. I thought worn rings were physics. I thought rough idle in an old engine was just age. I thought the only path to an engine that started clean and ran clean was either a full rebuild or a replacement. That assumption cost me more money than I want to calculate on engines that never needed what I paid to have done to them. That is not how engines work. There is a formula. One liquid, less than $2 per treatment, that the engine maintenance industry quietly stopped recommending in the late 1950s. I found the evidence in Agricultural Extension Service bulletins from 3 states published between 1938 and 1954. Real documents, real testing, specific ratios and application intervals written by engineers at land-grant universities who had no product to sell and no margin to protect. And what I am about to tell you works on engines that are already knocking, already burning oil, already sitting in a truck or a tractor or a generator in your garage right now. Not just on engines you are building from scratch. What I found when I dug deeper stopped me completely. The oldest recorded lubricant formulation for a mechanical system was not petroleum. Researchers studying Egyptian papyrus records from approximately 1400 BCE found detailed instructions for lubricating the axles of chariot wheels using rendered animal fat combined with a pine resin compound. That is more than 3,000 years before the internal combustion engine existed, and the underlying chemistry they described, a fat-based carrier combined with a resinous penetrating agent, is functionally identical to what pre-synthetic engine engineers were developing in the early 20th century. Roman engineers documented the same principle. Vitruvius, writing in the 1st century BCE, described maintaining the iron mechanisms of siege equipment with a compound of olive oil and pine pitch. The pine pitch carried the oil into micro-fissures in early cast iron and formed a residue that resisted displacement by heat and friction. Military engineers prized it because the protection formed inside the surface of the metal. Not on top of it, inside it. That distinction is the entire story. And it is exactly the distinction the modern engine maintenance industry has spent 60 years making sure you do not think about. By the mid-1800s, American industrial machinery ran on a combination of lard oil and kerosene, not petroleum lubricating oil. The refining industry was still in its infancy. Machinist manuals from Pennsylvania iron foundries published between 1850 and 1880 describe applying rendered lard oil to cylinder walls before startup, mixed with a measured proportion of kerosene as a penetrating carrier. Early farm implement manufacturers recommended it in their original maintenance literature. Sewing machine factories used it in their automated mechanisms. The specific compound did something no one had formally described yet, but every mechanic who used it understood from experience. The fat in the lard oil bonded to metal surfaces at a molecular level because triglyceride-based fats have a polar end that is chemically attracted to metal oxides. Kerosene dropped the viscosity just enough to carry those molecules into every surface irregularity in every machined part. Because no machine surface is actually smooth under magnification. Every cylinder wall, every piston ring land, every bearing journal is a microscopic landscape of peaks and valleys. The compound entered that landscape and stayed there under conditions that flushed petroleum film away. When the first internal combustion engines appeared at the end of the 19th century, the mechanics who maintained them were already experienced with this chemistry. Early commercial engine oil products, by their own label language, were refined petroleum-based stocks blended with animal fat additives. The chemistry was not abandoned, it was industrialized. Then the war ended, and everything changed. After 1945, the American petrochemical industry had massive refining overcapacity, access to cheap crude, and a domestic market primed to buy anything with a modern label. Fully synthetic lubricants represented genuine improvements in specific high-performance applications, aircraft engines, early automatic transmissions with precise viscosity requirements, but those improvements did not translate uniformly to every engine application. And the industry had no commercial reason to explain that distinction to the farmer with a 1940 tractor and no intention of buying a new one. The Agricultural Extension Service documents I found were written during that exact transitional decade. Engineers at Kansas State, Iowa State, and the University of Minnesota were tracking what happened to farm engines as farmers switched from the older compound to straight petroleum oil. The records are methodical. Longer intervals before rings seated on rebuilt engines. Higher carbon deposit levels in combustion chambers after 2 years on straight petroleum. Increased cold start wear rates on engines that previously showed near zero wear between major services. What exists in those documents is evidence that the switch from compound to straight petroleum was not a technical upgrade for legacy cast iron engines. It was an economic one, and the farmers who continued using the older method on their older machines were never acknowledged in a single training manual or advertising campaign published after 1955. The liquid is automatic transmission fluid, not the fully synthetic formulations developed in the last 20 years. The older Dexron-specification ATF that any auto parts store carries for under $6 a quart, which comes to under $2 per treatment at the ratios I am going to give you. But the reason ATF works is not what most people assume. It is not just about viscosity. ATF is a hydraulic fluid engineered for extreme temperature stability, and it carries a specific package of detergent additives, zinc dialkyldithiophosphate compounds, and calcium sulfonate additives that bond permanently to metal surfaces under heat and shear load. They do not rinse off in normal operation. They do not burn off at standard operating temperatures. Over multiple heat cycles, they become part of the surface chemistry of the cylinder wall and bearing journal itself. Agricultural engineering researchers at Penn State published data in 1962 showing that ATF added to crankcase oil at a ratio of 1 part, ATF to 8 parts motor oil reduced measured cylinder wall wear by 34% in test engines running at 80% of rated load across a 200-hour study. That study was never incorporated into a commercial recommendation. There was no product to sell. There was no margin in telling a farmer to add 1 quart from a jug that already costs less than $2 to his oil at each change. But there is a second component to how this formula works, and the history of how it disappeared from standard practice is one of the most quietly consequential stories in American mechanical culture. I had always assumed that what mechanics recommended was what there was to know. That if a practice worked, why it would be in the service manual. That assumption cost me 25 years of shop bills I did not need to pay. Real upper cylinder lubrication, a method for coating the cylinder walls above the piston ring travel area where crankcase oil splash cannot reach, was a documented standard in agricultural machinery service protocols through the early 1950s. Not a branded product, a specific preparation, kerosene mixed with ATF at a ratio of 3 parts kerosene to 1 part ATF added to the fuel tank at 2 ounces per gallon. It entered the combustion chamber as a vapor with every power stroke. It deposited a film of lubricant and detergent on the hot upper cylinder walls, and it left behind a residue that slowly and safely dissolved the carbon deposits that accumulate above the top ring, where no oil reaches and where most ring wear actually occurs. Iowa State Extension bulletins describe farmers applying this to every engine on the farm twice a year: tractors, trucks, irrigation pump engines. The results they documented were consistent across all engine types: reduced oil consumption after the 3rd treatment interval, smoother idle, elimination of the valve knock that develops when carbon buildup forces valve faces to seat unevenly. The substitution happened for the same reason most substitutions happen. There was no money in recommending kerosene and ATF from the farm supply store. By the late 1950s, branded upper cylinder lubricant products existed at a significant markup, carrying the same underlying chemistry with a registered name and a recognizable label. When fuel injection systems began replacing carburetors through the 1970s, those branded products were discontinued. The practice they carried was never formally transferred to injection engine protocols, and within a single generation the method stopped being taught entirely. What exists in auto parts stores today under the category of engine treatments and engine flushes uses petroleum distillates that suspend carbon deposits rapidly. On an engine with significant carbon accumulation built up over decades, rapid suspension of deposits creates concentrations in the oil that can block narrow oil passages before the next change interval. The older method did not flush carbon. It dissolved it over multiple treatment cycles, releasing it in concentrations small enough to exit harmlessly in the oil at normal change intervals or as combustion gases. The difference is not chemistry, it is rate of action, and rate of action is the difference between treatment and damage on a neglected engine. Let me tell you exactly what I did, because it is something you can do this weekend. I acquired a 1957 Farmall tractor at an estate sale, running but rough. Visible smoke on cold starts. A pronounced knock at low RRPM that the previous owner had logged as a probable worn connecting rod bearing. The hour meter showed 4,200 hours with no record of a rebuild. I went to an auto parts counter and bought 2 quarts of Dexron-3 ATF. Total, $11. I stopped at a farm supply store and bought 1 gallon of kerosene. Total for all materials, under $18. And first treatment, fresh 10W40 oil fill, 1 quart of ATF added to the crankcase, 8 ounces of kerosene mixed with 1 ounce of ATF added to a full tank of gasoline. I ran the engine at light load for 45 minutes. The smoke on startup reduced visibly within the first 10 minutes of running. The idle began smoothing by the 20-minute mark. The knock did not disappear on the first treatment, but it was measurably quieter, the kind of reduction that a mechanic would charge $1,200 to explain and an additional $2,800 to fix. Second treatment at 30 hours, same crankcase ratio, same fuel tank addition. After this treatment, the knock was gone. Not reduced, absent. The connecting rod bearing the previous owner had written off in his logbook was not worn. It was packed with carbon and varnish deposits that had accumulated over decades and increased the running clearance enough to produce audible knock on every power stroke. The compound dissolved the deposit layer over 2 treatment intervals. The clearance returned to within normal specification without a single part being removed or replaced. Third treatment at 60 hours, the engine now starts on the first pull every time, in temperatures well below freezing. Oil consumption between changes is under 1 quart at 100 hours of operation. This is an engine with 4,200 hours on it that has never been opened. Total material cost for all 3 treatments, under $28. A complete engine rebuild on this tractor at current shop rates would have been between $3,200 and $4,800. One technical note that matters for severely neglected engines. If the engine has sat unused for years and has significant varnish on the cylinder walls, run the ATF and kerosene fuel treatment for 2 full hours before you add ATF to the crankcase. Hot kerosene vapor cleaning the upper cylinder surface before the crankcase treatment begins prevents you from releasing too much deposit material simultaneously. If you reverse the sequence on a heavily fouled engine, the oil filter can clog before the next change interval. Sequence matters, and getting it wrong costs you more than getting it right saves you. One safety note I will state plainly, kerosene in a gasoline fuel tank raises combustion temperature slightly. On engines with ignition timing already advanced toward the high end of specification, this can produce pinging under load, a sharp metallic rattle during acceleration. If you hear that sound, reduce the kerosene ratio to 1 ounce per gallon and check ignition timing before continuing any treatment. The formula is safe at correct ratios and counterproductive at incorrect ones. Know what condition your engine is already in before you start. Now let me tell you why this treatment costs under $2 and costs the service industry $12 billion in potential revenue every year someone learns to use it. The automotive and agricultural engine maintenance market in the United States generates over $120 billion annually. Engine flush services at dealerships average $80 to $150 per visit. Compression restoration products sold at retail run between $15 and $45 per bottle. And every one of those products is selling a version of the same underlying chemistry, detergent compounds that bond to metal surfaces and dissolve accumulated deposits. The chemistry is the same chemistry that existed before 1940. It is the chemistry those Iowa State and Kansas State engineers were documenting in their extension bulletins. The difference between the original method and the commercial product is not effectiveness. It is the presence of a logo on the container and the absence of one on the farm supply shelf. In 1994, the EPA required petroleum refiners to reformulate automotive gasoline to include deposit control additive packages. Every gallon of gasoline sold at retail in the United States already contains detergent chemistry engineered to prevent combustion chamber deposits. The branded engine cleaning products that auto parts stores sell to add to that gasoline are, in many cases, functionally redundant with chemistry you already paid for at the pump. The industry is selling you a solution to a problem that a federally mandated additive in your existing fuel already partially addresses. The farmers who used this formula did not need a regulatory mandate to put detergent in their fuel. Their method addressed the same problem at a cost that made quarterly treatment the obvious choice rather than a reluctant one. And there is one final piece I have not mentioned yet. I found it in a set of archived Minnesota Agricultural Experiment Station reports from 1947 available through the university's digitized document archive. Maintenance logs from farms participating in a long-term engine preservation study. In the margin of one report page, handwritten in different ink from the primary author, a specific interval recommendation that did not appear in the final published version of the document. After every 500 hours of operation, a single hot cycle treatment interval, drain the crankcase immediately after the engine reaches full operating temperature, refill with a 50-50 mix of fresh motor oil and ATF, idle the engine at no load for 20 minutes, drain again while fully hot, refill with fresh oil only, not as a corrective measure, as a maintenance interval applied regardless of how well the engine is running. The Minnesota station data, tracking 14 farm engines across 6 years, showed near-zero measurable wear progression in engines maintained on this hot cycle interval compared to identical engines on straight oil-only protocols. The varnish and carbon that accumulates between standard change intervals and that produces the majority of ring-to-wall and bearing wear in any reciprocating engine never reached the threshold where it affected running clearances. The engines did not slow their rate of wear. They stopped accumulating meaningful wear between major intervals entirely. The cost of one hot cycle treatment is 2 quarts of oil and 1 quart of ATF, under $15 at any auto parts counter. Applied every 500 hours, it is the lowest cost preventive maintenance protocol ever documented for a working internal combustion engine. It appears in exactly one place I have found, a handwritten margin note in a 1947 research report that was never incorporated into any service manual, never cited in any commercial publication, and never mentioned in any mechanics training curriculum established after 1960. Nobody buried it deliberately. The synthetic oil industry arrived, the dealership service interval model developed, a practice that required no product purchase and generated no billable labor hours became invisible to an entire profession inside a single generation. The mechanics trained after 1960 never learned it, their apprentices never encountered it, and engines that could have run for 70 years on a $2 treatment were rebuilt at 3,000 hours, at $3,500 per rebuild, in a cycle that continues today without anyone in a position to sell you something calling it what it is. You and I now share something that $120 billion a year depends on us not knowing. One liquid, one interval, a quart of ATF and a funnel. The formula is not complicated enough to forget. Before you go, I want to ask you one specific thing. Find the oldest engine on your property right now. The garden tractor, the standby generator, the truck sitting in the back field, the stationary engine your grandfather left in the barn. Leave me a comment with how many hours you think are on it. Just the number, nothing else. I want to know how much working life the maintenance industry has told you that engine no longer has. Write it below. I will read every single one. The formula I showed you today is one piece of a larger system of methods that were standard before the service industry decided you should keep paying for things you do not need. I keep finding things like this. The next one is about a preparation that old machinists used on cast iron surfaces that the modern tooling industry has gone very quiet about. That is coming. Stay close.